Descend with me, if you dare, into the shadowed annals of human vanity, a realm where the pursuit of beauty transcends mere preening and becomes a pathological, often lethal, obsession. We are not here to dissect the benign coquetries of history, but to exhume its most terrifying aesthetic compulsions. Imagine an epic where the spectral, death-like pallor of arsenic poisoning was the zenith of feminine allure, a time when the very architecture of the human skull was forcibly reshaped to broadcast a fraudulent intellect. Picture a society that celebrated the systematic crippling of its women as the highest form of erotic grace, and an age of supposed scientific enlightenment that convinces populace to slather their faces with radioactive poison. This is a journey into a world where the phrase to die for was a grimly literal aspiration. We will unravel the deeply ingrained sociopathology that drove these trends, a collective psychosis that saw sentient beings choose a slow, agonizing demise, and excruciating torture over perceived vulgarity of a natural, healthy form. This is not a history of fashion. It is a morbid pathology report of entire civilizations, a chilling reminder that the quest for an inhuman visage often demands an inhuman price. Prepare yourselves, for the reflection you see in this dark mirror of the past may be more familiar than you think. The Victorian era, an age ostensibly scaffolded by the rigid timbers of moral rectitude and industrial certitude, was, in reality, a seething cauldron of cultural contradictions. Beneath the lugubrious drapery of societal norms, a fervent and often pernicious cult of beauty pullulated. The archetypal Victorian belle was not a figure of Rubicon health, but rather one of ethereal fragility, a creature seemingly unsullied by the sun's plebeian rays, but the quotidian rigors of physical labor. This ideal was a direct and conspicuous manifestation of a rigidly stratified class system, where a pallid complexion served as an unimpeachable testament to a life of aristocratic leisure. A tan was the indelible brand of the proletariat, a mark of vulgar toil beneath an unforgiving firmament. The acquisition of a deathly pallor became a veritable monomania for the aspiring and the elite alike. This societal obsession precipitated a panoply of peculiar and frequently detrimental practices. Ladies of fashion would meticulously eschew daylight, venturing forth only under protective penumbra of parasols or within the cloistered confines of horse-drawn broughams. They would imbibe prodigious quantities of vinegar and ingest chalk, hoping to induce a fashionable sickliness that mimicked the tragic, romanticized wasting disease of consumption, tuberculosis. But for the truly committed, for those who craved a beauty that was almost supernatural in its spectral luminescence, there existed a more direct and treacherous path: the clandestine ingestion of arsenic, known in the clandestine parlance of the time as aquadofana, or more ominously, inheritance powder. Arsenic was a well-documented and fearsome poison, notorious for its use in surreptitious assassinations. In a bizarre, macabre torsion of logic, it was this very lethality that rendered it so alluring as a cosmetic agent. Carefully escalated doses, arsenic wrought a peculiar havoc on the human body. It initiated the destruction of red blood cells, inducing a state of chronic anemia that resulted in the coveted porcelain-white complexion. It caused a slight edema, a subtle swelling of the subcutaneous tissues that would miraculously efface wrinkles and impart a plump, preternaturally youthful roundness to the face. Feverish sparkle, a phantasmagorical side effect of the poison's systemic assault. The user, in essence, was meticulously cultivating the appearance of a beautiful. The practice of arsenic eating, or arsenophagy, was often a furtive affair, a secret passed through conspiratorial whispers and the furtive exchange of complexion wafers. Small, arsenic-laced lozenges sold discreetly by apothecaries and chemists under euphemistic guises. Advertisements for these toxic bonbons were couched in disingenuous language, promising to remove all cutaneous imperfections and bestow a peerless complexion of alabaster purity. One of the most infamous purveyors of these toxic treats was a certain Dr. Mackenzie, whose arsenic complexion wafers became a sensation among the fashionable set. The instructions were deceptively simple: begin with a minuscule portion and gradually increase the dosage as tolerance, it was claimed, developed. What these vendors nefariously omitted was that this tolerance was a physiological fallacy. The arsenic was bioaccumulating, insidiously lodging itself in the user's fatty tissues and organs, a ticking time bomb of elemental toxicity. The initial effects were undeniably intoxicating, a Faustian bargain for ephemeral beauty. The skin would indeed become strikingly pale and luminous, but this fleeting perfection came at a diabolical cost. The chronic ingestion of arsenic led to a horrifying litany of ailments that unfolded with inexorable cruelty. The user would experience excruciating gastrointestinal distress, from violent projectile nausea and vomiting to debilitating abdominal cramps. Their hair would begin to fall out in pathetic clumps. Their nails would become brittle and discolored with transverse white bands known as mise lines, and a characteristic garlicky odor would emanate from their breath and sweat. As the poisoning progressed, the central and peripheral nervous systems would come under inexorable attack, leading to agonizing neuropathic pain, tremors, muscular weakness, and eventual paralysis. The end was a slow, agonizing dissolution from organ failure, a grotesque parody of the delicate, consumptive decline they had sought to emulate. The irony was as thick and choking as the London smog. In their desperate pursuit of an idealized fragility, were inflicting upon themselves a very real and gruesome one. The consumptive, wasting aesthetic they so fervently admired was no longer a mere affectation, self-inflicted reality. Perhaps one of the most poignant and cautionary figures is Empress Elizabeth of Austria. The famed Sisi, while not confirmed arsenophagist, was emblematic of the era's pathological obsession with appearance. Her fanatical pursuit of an impossibly tiny waist through torturous corsetry, and her bizarre, often dangerous, dietary regimens were a reflection of the same societal pressures that drove her less exalted contemporaries to the poison pot. The cessation of this deadly trend was not due to a sudden epiphany of collective sanity, but rather a slow confluence of factors. The burgeoning body of medical knowledge began to unequivocally link arsenic to its horrific catalog of side effects, and sensationalized, lurid press reports of arsenic deaths began to cast a morbid pall over practice. As the stolid Victorian era waned and the more dynamic 20th century dawned, a new aesthetic ideal began to emerge, one that valued a more active, sun-kissed vitality. The Gibson girl, with her healthy glow and athletic poise, began to supplant the frail, pallid, and poison-pilled Victorian belle. The ghost of the arsenic eater lingers, a chilling memento mori from a history of beauty, a testament to a time when a kiss could be. Let us now pivot from the toxic pallor of the Victorian abattoir to the luminous, yet no less punishing, aesthetic of the Renaissance. In the cradle of artistic and intellectual rebirth, a different species of physical tyranny took hold. It was an era that worshipped at the altar of intellect, and this profound veneration manifested in a most peculiar anatomical obsession. A high, glabrous, and elegantly domed brow was not merely a feature of pulchritude. It was considered a physical manifestation of one's innate intelligence and spiritual purity. The higher the brow, the more capacious the soul, the closer to God. This pervasive belief precipitated a campaign of follicular warfare, so extreme it would make modern depilatory methods seem like the gentlest of caresses. Prepare to delve into the world of the great forehead expansion, a time when women engaged in what can only be described as architectural grooming, reshaping their very hairlines with caustic chemicals and relentless, painful plucking, all to achieve a cerebral beauty that was as torturous as it was prized. In the richly tapestried and fiercely competitive courts of Renaissance Europe, from the Florence of the Medici to the England of the Tudors, the female visage was a canvas upon which prevailing societal values were meticulously and ruthlessly painted. The ascendant philosophy, steeped in the rediscovered tenets of Neoplatonism, sought to discern the divine reflected in the mortal form. The forehead, or frons in classical parlance, was widely believed to be the seat of the rational soul, the very portal through which divine wisdom and intellectual capacity were channeled into the individual. Consequently, a vast, luminous, and impeccably smooth forehead became the sine qua non of aristocratic beauty. It was a conspicuous billboard for one's nobility and sagacity, a stark, vertical declaration of superiority that stood in contrast to the low-browed, brutish physiognomy associated with the untutored peasantry. This cerebral ideal is immortalized with obsessive detail in the art of the period. Look closely at the portraits by Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, or Holbein the Younger. The female subjects, from the legendary beauty Simonetta Vespucci to the formidable Queen Elizabeth I, are almost universally depicted with impossibly high, their hairlines receding dramatically, sometimes to the very crown of the head. Their eyebrows are often completely absent or rendered as faint, sublimated arches, lest they vulgarly interrupt the sublime, uninterrupted expanse of skin. This was not mere artistic convention or license. It was a faithful reflection of a rigorous and often agonizing daily beauty regimen. To achieve this coveted cranial real estate, women embarked on a multi-pronged and merciless assault against their own hair follicles. The primary and most widespread method was epilation, a process far more brutal than the clinical term might suggest. Tweezers, often exquisitely crafted from precious metals like silver and jealously guarded as personal treasures, were the most basic tool in this war. Day after day, for hours on end, women would painstakingly pluck every stray hair from their forehead and temples, pushing the hairline back millimeter by painful, inflammatory millimeter. This was a continuous, Sisyphean battle against nature's persistent attempts at follicular regrowth. But for a more permanent and dramatic effect, more aggressive and dangerous measures were employed. Caustic depilatory concoctions were all the rage. Their recipes a horrifying testament to the trial and error, often disastrous, chemistry of the age, and particularly gruesome. Formula involved a paste of quicklime, the same powerfully corrosive substance used to dissolve mortar and hasten the decomposition of corpses. This volatile and villainous poultice would be slathered onto the hairline and left to work its destructive magic, chemically burning the hair and, with repeated and determined use, destroying the follicles themselves. The attendant risks were, of course, immense. Severe chemical burns, permanent and disfiguring scarring, alopecia cicatricialis, and the insidious threat of systemic poisoning were common and often accepted side effects in this quest for a perfect franz. Slightly less terrifying but equally bizarre, recipe called for a mixture of cat dung and vinegar, applied as a poultice with the belief that its acidic and ammoniac properties would inhibit hair growth. The assault was not limited to the hairline. Eyebrows were considered a vulgar, bestial interruption to the facial plane and were mercilessly eradicated. The same painful plucking and chemical warfare was waged upon them, leaving a smooth, serene, and uninterrupted canvas from the eyelashes to the newly established, artificially high hairline. In some extreme instances, even the eyelashes were thinned to further enhance the wide-eyed, otherworldly, and slightly startled gaze that was considered the ideal complement to the towering brow. The process didn't stop with hair removal. The skin of the forehead itself had to be perfected, rendered as pale and smooth as polished marble or vellum. This was achieved through the ubiquitous application of Venetian ceruse, a cosmetic foundation made from white lead and vinegar. As we now know, lead is a potent and cumulative neurotoxin, and the chronic, daily application of ceruse led to a host of horrifying consequences, including skin corrosion, muscle paralysis, dental decay, and ultimately organ failure and death. The very pursuit of a feature meant to signify intelligence was slowly destroying the brain of the pursuer. The culmination of this aesthetic was often the headdress. The hennin, that iconic, exaggeratedly conical hat of the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance, was not merely a flamboyant fashion statement. It was an integral part of the forehead expanding illusion. Its towering structure and the delicate veil that often draped from its peak were designed to draw the eye upward, exaggerating the height and expanse of the wearer's painstakingly cleared forehead. The elaborate hoods and coif of the Tudor era, such as the French hood and the English gable hood, were specifically designed to frame and showcase the hairless expanse of the brow, often with bands of velvet, pearls, and jewels strategically placed to emphasize its pristine dimensions. This tyranny of the forehead was a beauty standard that demanded not just unwavering commitment, but a high tolerance for chronic pain and a willful disregard for personal safety. We now voyage from the intellectualized landscapes of Renaissance Europe to the opulent, deeply stratified, and profoundly patriarchal society of Imperial China. We encounter a beauty standard of such profound and crippling cruelty that it stands in a class of its own in the sanguinary annals of human history. This was not a trend of toxic cosmetics or painful epilation, but practice that involved the systematic and deliberate mutilation of the female body, a torturous process initiated in the tender, formative years of childhood. We speak, of course, of foot binding, the centuries-long tradition of breaking and binding young girls' feet to create the 3-inch golden lotuses, grotesquely misshapen appendages that were considered the very apogee of feminine beauty and erotic allure. Prepare to confront the harrowing story of a beauty ideal that rendered millions of women permanently disabled, veritable prisoners in their own bodies, all for a distorted and fetishized notion of grace that was, at its core, a brutal and exquisitely effective instrument of patriarchal control. For nearly a millennium, from the 10th century Song dynasty to the tumultuous dawn of the 20th century, the practice of foot binding, or chanzu, held an iron and unyielding grip on the vast expanse of Chinese society, according to popular legend, as the whimsical affectation of a court dancer who bound her feet into the shape of a new moon to perform a lotus dance for the emperor metastasized into a pervasive and deeply entrenched cultural institution, as they were poetically and deceptively known, became an absolute prerequisite for any woman hoping to achieve a respectable social standing and, most pivotally, a desirable marriage. A woman with unbound natural feet was deemed coarse, shamefully peasant-like, and utterly unmarriageable within the upper and even middling echelons of society. Her prospects were nullified. The process of foot binding was a protracted ritual of excruciating and unmitigated agony, typically commencing when a girl was between the tender ages of 4 and 7, before the cartilaginous arch of her foot had fully ossified. The procedure was almost invariably carried out by an older female relative, a mother or grandmother, who had herself endured the same torment, thus perpetuating a cycle of inherited trauma. The timing was crucial and imbued with a cold pragmatism, often taking place in the winter months when the frigid temperatures would numb the feet, making the unendurable pain slightly more bearable. The ordeal began with the feet being soaked in a warm, murky concoction of herbs and animal blood, intended to soften the tissues and bones, making them more pliable for the impending assault. The girl's toenails would be clipped as short as possible to prevent them from becoming ingrown and festering within the bound flesh. Then came the most horrific and pivotal act. With the exception of the big toe, which was left to point forward, all the other toes would be forcibly bent downwards and broken, then folded with sickening force under the sole of the foot. The foot was then violently bent in half upon itself, the heel brought in as close as possible to the toes, breaking the tarsal and metatarsal bones of the arch with force that often elicited screams that were muffled by a gag or the uncaring walls of the women's quarters. Once the foot had been violently contorted into this profoundly unnatural shape, it was tightly and immovably bound with long strips of silk or cotton cloth, which were meticulously wound in a figure-8 pattern from the toes to the heel, pulling the two ends of the broken foot together with merciless tautness. The bandages were engineered to prevent any regrowth or unfurling of the shattered bones. The girl was then forced to walk on her mangled, the pressure of her own body weight further compounding the fractures and molding the foot into the desired crescent or lotus bud shape. The pain was unimaginable, a constant, throbbing, and searing torment that was unrelenting. The initial weeks were a living hell of inflammation, infection, suppuration, and unbearable agony. The bindings were removed every few days, not for relief, but for a grim maintenance session, to clean the feet, trim the nails, and scrape away any necrotic, putrefied flesh. The flesh would rot away, and sometimes one or more of the smaller toes would fall off completely. A gruesome outcome that was, with a perverse logic, seen as a positive sign, as it resulted in a smaller, more desirable, and more perfect foot. The bindings would then be reapplied, pulled even tighter than before. This cycle of torture would continue for at least 2 agonizing years, after which the bones would be permanently set in their broken, deformed position. The woman would have to continue binding her feet, not only to maintain their shape, but also to provide the structural support her broken arches could no longer offer. The ideal lotus foot was a mere 3 inches long, a tiny, pointed, and almost hoof-like appendage, perpetually encased in exquisitely embroidered silk slippers. But this aesthetic prize came at the cost of a lifetime of profound disability. Women with bound feet were incapable of walking with any semblance of normal locomotion. They could only manage a slow, mincing, and unsteady gait, known as a lotus gait, which, paradoxically, was lionized in poetry and art as a height of feminine grace and delicacy. They could not run, jump, or stand for long periods. They were effectively hobbled, their mobility and autonomy severely and intentionally curtailed. They were prisoners, confined to the gilded cage of the domestic sphere, physically incapable of straying far from home or engaging in any form of independent labor or social life. As we evolve from the ancient, institutionalized cruelties of imperial China into frenetic, syncopated, and gin-fueled optimism of the early 20th century, it would be tempting to assume that the age of lethal beauty had finally gassed its last. But we would be gravely, tragically mistaken. In the roaring 20s and the subsequent decade, a new and invisible poison infiltrated the boudoir, one born not of ancient malice or patriarchal subjugation, but of cutting-edge, Nobel Prize-winning science. This was the age of radium, the miracle element discovered by Marie Curie, which was promiscuously hailed as a panacea, a veritable liquid sunshine capable of curing all ills and, most enticingly, bestowing a vibrant, scientifically guaranteed youthful glow. An entire industry of radioactive quackery exploded, radium-infused creams, powders, elixirs, and even suppositories to an unsuspecting and science-worshipping public. Prepare to uncover the shockingly true story of the radia, a line of French cosmetics that promised a scientific path to beauty, a path that led its unwitting users down a terrifying and irreversible road of radiation poisoning, bone necrosis, and grotesque, unearthly disfigurement. The discovery of radium by Marie and Pierre Curie in 1898 ignited a global and often hysterical fascination. This mysterious element, which glowed with ethereal, ghostly blue light and emitted a seemingly magical, inexhaustible energy, was seized upon by the public imagination and the predatory instincts of capitalism. In an era of rapid technological advancement and almost religious faith in the infallibility of scientific progress, radium was imbued with near mythical, curative properties. It was a wonder drug of the age, promoted as a cure for a veritable encyclopedia of ailments, from cancer and arthritis to impotence and old age. Health spas offered radium-laced water. For bathing and drinking, radioactive pendants were sold to be worn against the skin, and even radium-infused chocolate bars and bread were marketed for their supposed health benefits. It was in this fervent climate of radioactive quackery that the beauty industry saw its most lucrative and ultimately most dangerous opportunity. The central premise of radium cosmetics was based on a scintilla of scientific truth, perversely twisted into a monstrous falsehood. Radiation in controlled, high doses radiotherapy was indeed being used with some success to destroy cancerous tumors. Charlatans and opportunistic extrapolated the seductive idea that in small, gentle, sub-exciting doses, the same atomic energy could stimulate healthy cells, revitalizing the skin and reversing the inexorable process of aging. The promise was intoxicating, a vibrant, luminous complexion, born not from mere pigment or powder, but from a very energy of the atom itself, they proclaimed with messianic fervor, could now be achieved through the unimpeachable authority of physics. The most infamous and archetypal of these radioactive brands was Doradia, launched with great fanfare in France in the early 1930s. The name itself was a brazen, almost proud declaration of its toxic contents, thorium chloride and radium bromide. The brand was the brainchild of a certain Dr. Alfred Curie, despite his audacious claims, bore absolutely no relation to the famed scientist, but whose shared surname lent a powerful and deliberately deceptive air of legitimacy to his poisonous enterprise. The face of the brand was a glamorous, Art Deco-style illustration of a woman's face, bathed in a celestial radioactive glow, with the authoritative tagline, La Beauté, Le Rejuvenement, La Science, Beauty, Rejuvenation, Science. Though Radia's product line was alarmingly extensive, promising a complete, system-wide radioactive rejuvenation. It included a face cream, a powder, a rouge, a lipstick, and even a regenerating toothpaste containing both thorium and radium. The advertisements, published in popular, sophisticated magazines like L'Illustration and Marie Claire, were masterpieces of pseudo-scientific propaganda. They promised to stimulate cellular vitality, firm the muscles, eliminate fats, stop wrinkles from forming, and treat skin blemishes. The would be absorbed by the skin, its gamma rays penetrating deep into the tissues to activate the circulation and restore youthful suppleness. They were, in essence, selling a death ray as a beauty treatment. The products were a phenomenal success. Captivated by the promise of scientific miracle and the allure of a perpetually youthful glow, eagerly slathered their faces with these radioactive concoctions. The immediate effects were likely minimal, perhaps a slight inflammatory reddening of the skin, erythema, which might have been tragically misinterpreted as a healthy, vibrant blush. But the true effects were insidious, cumulative, and utterly devastating. The radium and thorium in these cosmetics were alpha and gamma emitters. When applied to the skin, they would relentlessly bombard the living tissues with ionizing radiation, leading to cellular damage, chromosomal aberrations, mutations, and a dramatically increased risk of aggressive skin cancers like basal cell carcinoma and squamous cell carcinoma. But the greater, more systemic danger came from inadvertent ingestion. The radium-laced toothpaste was, of course, a direct route for the poison to enter the body, but even the creams and powders could be introduced through hand-to-mouth contact or absorption through broken skin. Once inside the body, radium's chemical similarity to calcium meant it was a bone seeker. It was readily absorbed from the gut, carried to the bloodstream, and deposited in the skeleton, where it would become incorporated into the very matrix of the bones. There it would settle for the remainder of the victim's life, emitting a constant, relentless, and inescapable stream of destructive radiation from within. The results were a catalog of horrors straight. The radiation would destroy the bone marrow, leading to fatal aplastic anemia. It would attack the bone tissue itself, causing a condition that became known as radium jaw. It would literally crumble and rot away, leading to grotesque facial disfigurement, the loss of teeth, excruciating pain, and often fatal hemorrhages as the necrotic bone eroded into major blood vessels. The bones throughout the body would become brittle and riddled with osteosarcomas, aggressive, malignant tumors that cause unimaginable agony. The tragic, well-documented story of the Radium Girls, female factory workers in the United States who painted watch dials with glow-in-the-dark and who suffered these same horrifying afflictions after habitually licking their brushes to a fine point, ran parallel to more diffuse, less documented plight of the users of radioactive cosmetics. But while the Radium Girls case eventually became a landmark in labor rights and occupational safety, the victims of brands like Doradia often suffered and died in silence, their ghastly ailments misdiagnosed, or their connection to the miracle creams overlooked by a medical establishment still grappling with the novel horrors of radiation sickness. The downfall of the radioactive cosmetics industry was gradual, a slow dawning of a terrible truth. As the medical community's understanding of chronic radiation poisoning grew, and as the horrifying stories of the Radium Girls and other radiation victims came to light, the tide of public opinion began to turn. The ethereal glow of radium was revealed to be the phosphorescent harbinger of a slow and gruesome death. We have journeyed through the most shadowed and perverse corridors of history, from the arsenic-laced parlors of Victorian England to the blood-soaked binding rooms of Imperial China, from the glabrous, lead-painted brows of the Renaissance to the ghostly, radioactive glow of the Jazz Age. We have borne witness to the myriad and monstrous forms that the human pursuit of beauty can assume, a veritable litany of poisons, scalpels, bindings, and inexorable societal pressures that have shaped, brutalized, and desecrated the human form for millennia. With its unique cultural neuroses and philosophical justifications, has concocted its own particular brand of physical tyranny, its own impossible and inhuman ideal for which its people have been willing to suffer, to sicken, and ultimately to die. From our modern vantage point, to look back upon these historical atrocities with a sense of horrified superiority, to dismiss these practices as the sanguinary follies of a bygone, unenlightened, and superstitious age. We have, after all, ostensibly traded quicklime for laser hair removal, Venetian ceruse for scientifically formulated, hypoallergenic foundations, and radium for retinol. But have we truly escaped the underlying pathology? Or have we merely refined the instruments of our own self-flagellation, swapping crude, fast-acting poisons for more sophisticated, slow-acting toxins, and overt, ritualized mutilation for the sanitized, clinical violence of the operating theater and the injectable needle? The fundamental, disquieting, and inescapable truth is that the face of beauty's tyranny, though it may change its mask with the passing of each generation, remains hauntingly, stubbornly the same. The same societal pressures that drove a Victorian woman to ingest arsenic are at play in the multi-trillion-dollar diet, wellness, and cosmetic industries that relentlessly convince us to view our natural bodies as flawed projects in need of constant, punishing, and expensive renovation. The same patriarchal desire for control that manifested in the quite literal crippling of women through foot-binding echoes in the cosmetic surgery trends that seek to mold the female form into an increasingly narrow, homogenized, and often neotenous ideal, one that prioritizes a manufactured artifice over authenticity.